On May 23, 2019, after more than 3 decades on Florida's death row, the state carried out a sentence that many believed was long overdue. The man strapped to the gurney was not just another name in America's long list of death row inmates. He was Bobby Joe Long, a serial predator whose reign of terror in the 1980s brought fear to every woman who walked the streets of Tampa Bay. To his neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary man. To his victims, he was a monster hiding in plain sight. But the story of Bobby Joe Long did not begin with the flashing cameras outside Florida State Prison on execution day. It began decades earlier, in a childhood scarred by genetic disorder, brutal head injuries, and a deeply complicated relationship with the women in his life. Long's path from bullied boy to abusive husband, to rapist, and finally to cold-blooded killer is one of the darkest sagas in American true crime history. Over the course of 8 terrifying months in 1984, Long abducted, raped, and murdered at least 10 women. Their bodies were left discarded in wooded groves, ditches, and fields, each crime scene telling the same horrifying story of violence and domination. For months, Tampa lived in fear, not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. This is the story of Bobby Joe Long, his troubled beginnings, his double life as a predator, the shattered lives of his victims, and the extraordinary survivor whose courage brought him down. From his childhood scars to his final meal and the silence of his last moments before execution, we uncover the man behind the monster, and the lessons his crimes left behind. So before we begin this deep dive into one of Florida's most chilling true crime cases, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button and the notification bell so you don't miss our future episodes. Bobby Joe Long was born on October 14, 1953, in the small town of Canova, West Virginia. From the very beginning, his life was marked by challenges that would set him apart from the children around him. He was born with a rare genetic disorder known as Klinefelter syndrome, a condition where boys are born with an extra X chromosome. This syndrome caused severe hormonal imbalances that shaped his physical appearance and emotional world. By the time he reached puberty, Bobby Joe developed gynecomastia, the abnormal growth of breast tissue in males. Imagine being a young boy in the 1960s, surrounded by peers who were eager to grow into traditional masculinity, while your own body betrayed you. For Bobby Joe, it was a source of humiliation that haunted him. Classmates mocked him relentlessly. The cruel nicknames, the pointing, the laughter, these left scars deeper than anything visible. His mother sought corrective surgeries in an attempt to normalize his appearance, but the scars of those procedures, both physical and psychological, never disappeared. For young Bobby Joe, his own reflection became a source of shame. And that shame, mixed with anger, began brewing deep within him. But his medical struggles weren't his only burden. Bobby Joe's childhood was also marked by a series of traumatic head injuries. At just 4 years old, he nearly drowned in a swimming pool. Not long after, he was struck by cars on multiple occasions, endured accidents on bicycles, and even suffered injuries from falling off a pony. One blow to the head might be enough to cause long-term neurological damage, but for Bobby Joe, the incidents were repeated and devastating. Years later, neurologists would suggest that these traumas may have permanently damaged the parts of his brain responsible for impulse control, aggression, and decision-making, the very traits that define how a person navigates right and wrong. And if his body and brain were not already enough of a battlefield, his home environment provided no refuge. Bobby Joe was raised primarily by his mother, Louetta, in a cramped and unstable household. His father had little to no presence, leaving Louetta to raise Bobby Joe mostly on her own. She was a strong-willed woman, but her lifestyle created complications. For years, Bobby Joe shared a bed with his mother well into early adolescence, a fact that later raised eyebrows among psychologists. At the same time, Louetta frequently entertained different men, sometimes in plain view of her son. To a young boy, this was confusing, humiliating, and deeply unsettling. Over time, these experiences began to twist his understanding of intimacy, loyalty, and women in general. This cocktail of instability at home, medical trauma, and social ridicule left Bobby Joe feeling like an outsider, resentful, angry, and ashamed. In school, he struggled academically, failing the first grade and never finding his footing in the classroom. By the 10th grade, he dropped out entirely, feeling more comfortable rebelling against authority than conforming to it. But beneath this rebellion, a darker issue was emerging, an insatiable sexual appetite that bordered on obsession. That hunger only grew worse after a life-altering motorcycle accident in 1974, which left him with yet another severe head injury. Not long after, he married his high school girlfriend, Cynthia. Together, they had 2 children, and on the outside, it looked like Bobby Joe was settling into a normal life. But inside the marriage, Cynthia lived through years of physical and sexual abuse. She would later describe him as controlling, violent, and incapable of empathy. After 6 turbulent years, Cynthia divorced him in 1980, taking the children and leaving Bobby Joe on a downward spiral that was just beginning to show its darkest edge. As we peel back the layers of Bobby Joe Long's childhood, one question begins to take shape. Was this man shaped by the cruel hand of fate, his genes, his injuries, his toxic upbringing, or was something far more sinister already embedded in his nature from the very beginning? Before Bobby Joe Long ever took a life, he was already leaving behind a devastating trail of victims. By the early 1980s, his violent compulsions had transformed into something calculated, manipulative, and terrifyingly effective. He wasn't a killer yet, but his crimes revealed the chilling evolution of a predator who had perfected the art of stalking and exploiting vulnerability. It was around 1981 that Long developed the method that would later earn him the name, the classified ad rapist. At first glance, it seemed almost mundane. He would sit down with the daily newspaper, scanning through the classified section where women posted ads for items like furniture, televisions, or other household goods. For most people, the classifieds were a place of harmless transactions, where neighbors met to sell and buy. But for Bobby Joe Long, it became a hunting ground. Once he found a target, he would call the number and arrange to meet. His charm and calm demeanor made him appear like any other potential buyer. He would arrive at the home, often in the middle of the day when neighbors weren't watching too closely. At first, everything seemed normal. He would look at the item, maybe ask a few questions, maybe even bargain a little. But then the mask would drop. Long would overpower the women inside their own homes, tie them down, and rape them. Victims who later survived described him as cold and detached, as if the violence was not fueled by rage or passion but by a compulsive need to dominate and control. He rarely yelled, rarely lost his composure. His calmness made the attacks even more terrifying, because it proved that he wasn't acting out of impulse, he was acting out of method. After the assaults, in some cases, he would rob his victims, taking small amounts of cash or valuables, as though the act of rape was not enough, as though he needed to remind them that he could strip away everything, safety, dignity, even possessions. Authorities would later estimate that between 1981 and 1984, Long may have raped over 50 women across South Florida using this method. But the true number may never be known. Many victims never came forward at the time, paralyzed by fear, guilt, or the social stigma that surrounded rape cases in the early 1980s. Back then, reporting sexual assault often meant being doubted, shamed, or re-traumatized in court. For many, silence felt like the only option, and Bobby Joe Long thrived in that silence. In 1981, law enforcement finally caught up with him. He was arrested for rape, and one of his victims bravely testified, describing in detail how he had lured her into trust before violently attacking her. For a moment, it looked as though justice might come early. But in a devastating blow to his victims, his conviction was overturned on appeal, citing technical issues in the case. And with that, Bobby Joe Long was free again, free to return to the streets, free to continue his predatory pattern. This failure of the system gave Long the opportunity he needed to escalate further. The rapes were no longer enough to satisfy his violent compulsions. His appetite for control and domination was growing, and soon, he would cross the line from serial rapist to serial killer. By the spring of 1984, the darkness inside Bobby Joe Long had reached its breaking point. Years of unchecked violence and sexual assault had built into a storm that could no longer be contained. His compulsions were escalating, and the crimes that once satisfied him, those dozens of rapes committed under the guise of classified ads, were no longer enough. Long was ready to cross the ultimate line, and when he did, the city of Tampa Bay would become the hunting ground for one of the most prolific and terrifying killers America had ever seen. Over the next 8 months, the Tampa Bay area descended into fear. Long prowled the streets, always searching, always hunting. His victims were not chosen at random, yet they were not bound by a single profile either. Many were young women who worked as sex workers or dancers, vulnerable targets whom society often failed to protect. But others were ordinary women, with no connection to that world at all. This showed that Bobby Joe Long was not just a predator of opportunity, he was a man whose violence knew no boundaries, whose rage and hunger for control demanded victims wherever he could find them. The first to fall was Michelle Denise Sims, just 22 years old, a former beauty contestant who still carried the youthful glow of someone with her whole future ahead. In May of 1984, she disappeared, only for her body to be found near Interstate 4. She had been raped, bound with rope, and brutally murdered. Michelle's death would later be the one that secured Long's place on death row, but at the time, it was just the beginning, a horrifying warning of what was yet to come. Soon after, another young woman vanished, Elizabeth Loudenbach, also just 22. She wasn't involved in sex work. She wasn't out late at night in dangerous places. Elizabeth was simply walking home when Long spotted her. He attacked, raped her, and then strangled her, discarding her body as though her life meant nothing. Her murder shattered the illusion that ordinary women were safe. Long wasn't hunting just in the shadows of Tampa's red light districts. He was capable of striking anyone, anywhere. Then came Vicki Elliott, 21 years old, who worked late nights at a local diner. On September 7, she left her shift and never made it home. For weeks, her family held out desperate hope that she might be found alive. But when her body was discovered, that hope was crushed. Vicki's throat had been cut, and, in a gruesome display of power, Long had posed her body grotesquely, as if to make a statement about his dominance even after death. It was a moment that underscored his escalating cruelty. His next known victim was Chanel Williams, just 18 years old, vibrant and full of promise. She was his only black victim, but her murder was no less brutal. Chanel was shot in the head and left discarded like trash. At the crime scene, investigators recovered something crucial, strands of a rare red trilobal nylon carpet fiber. At the time, police didn't know it yet, but this carpet fiber would become the key to unlocking Bobby Joe Long's web of murders. The terror didn't stop. Karen Dinsfriend, 28, disappeared and was later found murdered. Soon after, Kimberly Hops, 22, was also discovered dead in an orange grove, her body dumped carelessly in the same way as so many before her. Each new body meant another grieving family, another set of unanswered prayers, another piece of Tampa's sense of safety ripped away. Every crime scene carried a signature: rape, brutal violence, and that same red trilobal nylon carpet fiber. Investigators began piecing together a pattern, linking these women not only by their tragic fates but by the physical evidence Bobby Joe Long unknowingly left behind. The fibers, later traced to the carpet in his Dodge Magnum, would prove to be the thread that unraveled his entire killing spree. As the months dragged on, Tampa Bay became gripped by terror. Women refused to walk alone, especially at night. Parents warned their daughters, clubs and bars began closing earlier, and the police increased patrols across the city. But even as the community held its breath, praying for the nightmare to end, Long kept killing. Each new attack seemed to mock the police, a reminder that the predator was still out there, hunting, choosing his next victim. The city was trapped in fear. And while the police were closing in, Bobby Joe Long was far from finished. On the night of November 3, 1984, a 17-year-old girl named Lisa McVeigh was riding her bike home after a grueling late-night shift at the Krispy Kreme where she worked. She was exhausted, pedaling through the dimly lit streets of Tampa, unaware that fate was about to thrust her into the nightmare of a lifetime. Out of the darkness, a car suddenly pulled alongside her, and before she could react, a man grabbed her at gunpoint. It was Bobby Joe Long, and Lisa had just become his next target. For the next 26 hours, Lisa was held captive in Long's apartment. Blindfolded, bound, and terrified, she endured repeated assaults. But unlike so many before her, Lisa was not frozen by fear. She was sharp, calculating, and, unbelievably, thinking about survival. At just 17 years old, she used her wits and resilience to do what none of his other victims had been able to do, to outsmart him. Lisa understood instinctively that if she panicked, she would die. So she did the opposite. She began speaking to Long in a calm, almost soothing voice, treating him less like a monster and more like a troubled human being. She shared pieces of her life with him, telling him she had a sick father at home who needed her care. It wasn't true, but it planted a seed of empathy in Long's mind, a reason for him to see her not as disposable prey, but as a person worth sparing. But Lisa didn't stop there. Every second in captivity, she was absorbing her surroundings with razor-sharp focus. She left fingerprints on the bathroom surfaces, ensuring that evidence of her presence remained. She carefully memorized the layout of his apartment, noting small but crucial details, the furniture, the way the light hit the blinds, even the patterns in the carpet. She studied the feel of his car upholstery, paid attention to the sounds of the roads he drove, and even counted the turns and curves as he transported her blindfolded. Lisa was building a mental map that could later be handed to investigators like a blueprint of her abductor's world. And then, something extraordinary happened. After 26 harrowing hours of captivity, after enduring the unimaginable, Long did something no one expected: he let Lisa go. He drove her back toward her neighborhood and dropped her near her home, alive. Many believe it was Lisa's remarkable ability to humanize herself that swayed him, convincing him to see her not as another victim to discard but as someone he could release. But Lisa's ordeal didn't end when she stumbled out of that car. No. Her real test had just begun. Instead of retreating into silence like so many victims forced into fear and shame, Lisa ran straight to the police. And when she sat down with detectives, she didn't just give them fragments of a story, she delivered a masterclass in survival intelligence. She recalled the exact model and color of his car. She described the texture of his apartment carpet. She remembered the ATM withdrawals he had made while she was in captivity. She gave officers a step-by-step account of where she had been taken, how long the drives were, and even the slight curves in the roads. Every detail was precise, and every detail matched up with evidence investigators were already compiling. Lisa McVeigh, a 17-year-old teenager who had been through the kind of trauma that destroys lives, had instead become the key to bringing down one of America's most prolific serial killers. And within just 2 weeks, thanks to her bravery and meticulous memory, police would close in on Bobby Joe Long. On the morning of November 16, 1984, the streets of Tampa seemed quiet, but beneath the calm, a storm of justice was about to strike. For weeks, detectives had been carefully piecing together every shred of evidence: Lisa McVeigh's astonishingly detailed testimony, ATM surveillance logs, eyewitness reports, and, most importantly, those rare red trilobal carpet fibers that investigators had meticulously traced back to a Dodge Magnum belonging to Bobby Joe Long. The moment came when officers executed a strategic traffic stop, pulling Long over as he drove. The man who had once stalked the streets with unchecked violence was now face to face with the very law he had evaded for years. Calm and detached, Long surrendered without resistance, his reign of terror finally over. At the police station, the wall seemed to close in on him. Interrogators pressed, and the evidence piled higher and higher. And then, in a move that stunned even the seasoned detectives in the room, Bobby Joe Long confessed. He admitted, almost matter-of-factly, to the abduction, rape, and murder of women across Tampa Bay. His words were chillingly devoid of remorse, spoken with the same cold precision that had defined his crimes. It was a confession that sealed his fate. In the years that followed, the legal machine turned swiftly. Between 1985 and 1986, Long faced the courts in one of the most high-profile trials in Florida's history. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 8 murders, an admission that shocked the families of victims but also brought some measure of closure to their grief. The sentencing was unlike anything the state had seen before. For his crimes of sexual battery, kidnapping, and murder, Long was handed an avalanche of punishment, 28 life sentences, plus an additional 99 years. And yet, beyond those stacked sentences, one charge stood out with finality: the murder of 22-year-old Michelle Denise Sims, a young woman whose life had been brutally taken and whose case would become the cornerstone of Long's death sentence. For Michelle's murder, the court delivered the ultimate penalty: death by electrocution. The courtroom itself was a theater of conflicting narratives. Prosecutors painted Long as a calculating predator, a man who had deliberately hunted women for his own twisted gratification. They laid bare the horror of his crimes, displaying the forensic evidence, the patterns of the killings, and the voices of families left shattered. On the other side, Long's defense team fought desperately to construct a different picture. They argued that he was not a monster by design but a man broken by forces outside his control: his rare genetic disorder, Klinefelter syndrome, which had left him physically and emotionally scarred from a young age, his series of devastating head injuries, which neurologists believed could have damaged the very parts of his brain that governed impulse and aggression, and his toxic, unstable childhood, filled with humiliation, neglect, and a twisted relationship with the women in his life. But when the jury listened, when they weighed the evidence against the pleas for mercy, their decision was nearly unanimous. Out of 12 jurors, 11 voted for death. The scale of Long's brutality, the cold efficiency of his crimes, and the trail of grief he had left behind were too much to ignore. Bobby Joe Long, the man who had once terrorized Tampa Bay, was now condemned to die for it. With the verdict delivered, the weight of justice finally began to press down. Families of the victims wept, some in relief, others in quiet devastation. For them, no sentence could restore the lives lost, but it was a moment of acknowledgement, a recognition by the state that their daughters, sisters, and loved ones had not been forgotten. Long, for his part, sat expressionless, the same chilling calm he had displayed in interrogation now stretched across his face in the courtroom. The predator had been caged, and the law had spoken its final word. For more than 34 long years, Bobby Joe Long sat confined within the concrete walls of Florida State Prison, condemned to death, his fate sealed by the courts but drawn out by the slow march of appeals. Inside the narrow confines of a death row cell, his world was reduced to steel bars, cement floors, and the monotony of isolation. Each day followed the same routine: meals slid through a slot in the door, brief opportunities for exercise in a small caged yard, and endless hours of silence broken only by the sounds of guards making their rounds or the distant echoes of other inmates facing the same grim destiny. For a man who had once prowled the streets of Tampa with terrifying freedom, the punishment was absolute, his movements now measured in steps between a bed, a sink, and a toilet. Over the decades, Long's name resurfaced periodically in the headlines, usually when a new appeal was filed or denied. Attorneys tried to raise questions about his mental health, his childhood trauma, and the medical conditions that had shaped him, but time after time the courts rejected those arguments, standing firm on the weight of evidence and the brutality of his crimes. The survivors and families of victims watched as year after year passed, knowing that while Long's life continued in the shadow of death row, their daughters and sisters would never come home. To them, justice seemed painfully slow, but it remained steady, unyielding, and always moving toward its inevitable conclusion. While Bobby Joe Long's world shrank to a cell and a legal battle he could never win, the life of Lisa McVeigh, the teenager who had survived his grasp, expanded in ways no one could have predicted. Far from letting the horrors of those 26 hours destroy her, Lisa transformed her trauma into strength. She chose a path that kept her face to face with the kind of darkness she had once endured, becoming a law enforcement officer in Hillsborough County. Day after day, she worked to protect the vulnerable, to fight for justice, and to ensure that predators like Long could never again roam unchecked. Her story became one of resilience, survival, and triumph, a sharp contrast to the man who had tried to silence her but ultimately empowered her transformation. For the rest of the world, Bobby Joe Long became a name remembered with fear and disgust, a case study in violent crime, a killer whose methods were dissected in documentaries, books, and court transcripts. But behind the prison gates, he lived in anonymity, a prisoner identified only by his number, waiting as time, appeals, and the machinery of justice slowly carried him toward his execution date. The passage of years did nothing to erase the devastation he had caused, but they underscored the difference between him and his victims. While his life dragged on in confinement, his victims remained frozen in time: Michelle Denise Sims forever 22, Elizabeth Loudenbach forever 22, Vicky Elliott forever 21, Chanel Williams forever 18, Karen Dinsfriend forever 28, Kimberly Hobbs forever 22, their futures stolen in an instant, their families left with nothing but memories and grief. And so Bobby Joe Long remained on death row, a man who once believed himself untouchable, now waiting as the state, the courts, and the memories of his victims closed in around him. On the evening of May 23, 2019, after decades of appeals, legal battles, and the slow passage of time, the long-awaited day of reckoning finally arrived for Bobby Joe Long inside the heavily guarded walls of Florida State Prison. Preparations were made for his execution by lethal injection. For more than 34 years, he had lived in the shadow of death, but now there would be no more delays, no more courtroom arguments, only the final chapter in a case that had haunted Florida since the 1980s. Hours before he was led into the death chamber, Long was given the chance to order his final meal. He chose a plate of roast beef, crispy strips of bacon, French fries, and a soda, a strangely ordinary meal for a man whose crimes had been anything but ordinary. Prison records noted that he ate in silence, showing no outward sign of fear or remorse. It was his last act of choice, the last moment of control he would ever have. As the hour of execution approached, the death chamber was prepared. Rows of chairs were placed for official witnesses, reporters, and, most importantly, the survivors and family members of his victims who had waited more than 3 decades to see justice carried out. When the time came, Bobby Joe Long was led into the chamber, dressed in a standard prison uniform. He was secured to a gurney, his arms outstretched, intravenous lines connected, the sterile efficiency of the procedure in stark contrast to the brutality of the crimes that had brought him here. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, Long chose silence. He declined to speak a single word. There would be no apology, no last-minute confession, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Instead, he stared forward, expressionless, as if resigned to the inevitability of what was to come. At exactly 6:55 p.m., the lethal drugs flowed into his veins, and after several minutes, Bobby Joe Long was pronounced dead. The announcement echoed through the chamber: the life of a man who had once terrorized Tampa Bay was finally over. Outside, the Florida Department of Corrections released the official statement of his death, and for many, it marked the closing of one of the darkest chapters in Florida's criminal history. Among the witnesses in the chamber that night were survivors and grieving relatives of the women whose lives Long had stolen. Some wept quietly, tears flowing for loved ones lost decades earlier, while others expressed a measure of relief, as if a weight had finally been lifted from their shoulders. For them, the execution was not about vengeance but about closure, an end to the long and painful wait for justice. Among those witnesses stood Lisa McVeigh, the teenager who had survived Bobby Joe Long's horrific captivity in 1984 and whose bravery had ultimately led to his capture. Now a seasoned law enforcement officer, she faced her attacker one last time, not as a victim but as a symbol of resilience. After the execution, she spoke firmly to reporters, her words echoing far beyond the prison gates. "I chose not to be a victim. I chose to be a survivor." And with that, the story of Bobby Joe Long came to its end, not with the chaos and terror that had once defined his life, but with the quiet hum of machines inside a prison chamber and the strength of those who had endured his violence and emerged stronger. His death closed the book on a killer, but the courage of his victims, especially Lisa McVeigh, ensured that his legacy would forever be remembered not for the power he once held, but for the strength of those who survived him. In the end, Bobby Joe Long's life ended the way he chose to live it, cold and silent. But the voices of his victims, and the strength of those who survived him, still echo. What do we take away from stories like this? That evil can hide in plain sight, but courage can shine even in the darkest moments. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest chapters of history.